now the exciting conclusion of the Byrds here on Pop Goes the 60s. For many a 60s band, the 1970s usually marked that band's demise. That was not really the case in the Byrds, and they soldiered on into the 70s despite many lineup changes. Now by 1970, the Byrds had reestablished themselves as a popular live act in a time when live music became an even more integral part of the music listening experience. Just to bring you up to speed with the former Byrds, obviously David Crosby became the biggest star with the superstar group, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and they were the biggest touring group in 1970, so it's about as big as you can get. Gene Clarke had spent 2 years with Dillard and Clarke, that's with Doug Dillard, the banjo player from the Dillards. They did 2 albums. Chris Hillman forgave Graham Parsons for leaving the Byrds high and dry back in South Africa, and they formed the Flying Burrito Brothers. And then Michael Clarke, he played with both the Burrito Brothers and Dillard and Clarke, so there was still a camaraderie between ex-Byrd members. 1970 began with the replacement of another member. John York, the bass player, had grown tired of playing all the old Byrds hits, and he was replaced by a guy named Skip Battin. Now, Skip Battin had been in a duo with Gary Paxton in the early days called Skip and Flip. He was about 6 or 7 years older than the other Byrds, and he had been a songwriter with Kim Fowley and a producer. John York's style of bass playing was more of a staccato style of playing, which worked really well for that heavy rock sound that the Byrds had on the last couple albums when they decided to do heavier rock. Skip Battin, however, was a little funkier, and I think that Clarence White and both Gene Parsons really liked the idea of adding that to the stage repertoire. Now, in February of 1970, the Byrds were scheduled to record an album with Bob Dylan, and they had a long-standing relationship, and apparently they decided to do an album together. Unfortunately, some of the tour dates didn't jive with one another, and there was some miscommunication on when to record, so that ended up not happening, and Dylan went on to record Self-Portrait. Now, at this point, the Byrds had reinstated Dixon and Tickner as managers, so they went back to some people they knew and started work on the new album called Untitled. Now, you may have noticed in the last couple of albums that Roger McGuinn was a little bit low on material, and the reason for that is he was working on a Broadway play with another writer called Jacques Levy, and it was called Gene Trip. It was a Broadway show, and it was like a country rock musical set in the 1800s in the Old West. And that didn't get off the ground. They couldn't get the financial backing for it. So some of the songs that McGuinn had written were brought forward, and they were pretty top-notch. The 5 songs that he contributed are some of his best songs of his career. I'm going to catch that horse if I can. So the album they were recording is called Untitled, and it's a double album. And Terry Melcher produced one disc, which was the studio disc, and the other one was live, and that was produced by Jim Dixon. So Dixon finally gets to produce a Byrds album. See the earth, how sweet it smells. I don't know how it feels. Catfish pie in a creek river. I'm the lover of the bayou. If all I was passing time, my life was just a season. Now those 3 songs were Roger McGuinn songs from the aborted Broadway show, so those are very good songs. And one of the live sides is comprised entirely of 8 Miles High, so it's like a 16+ minute version of that song. Yeah, it's a little tedious, but it was appropriate for the time. You know, I could do without the bass solo and things like that, but it really allowed for audiences to hear how the Byrds would stretch out, and that was pretty appropriate for bands to do. You know, everybody had their album side, one track on one album side, like In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, so the Byrds were no different. One of the advantages of adding Skip Battin is he was a composer, so these next 3 songs are his contributions. I'm really glad ahead of you. Starlight crossed my eyes, she took me by surprise. Yesterday's train is rolling. Can you touch it through the mist? So So those Skip Battin songs are pretty solid. That last one was co-written with Gene Parsons. That was Yesterday's Train. And another thing that makes this album so solid and warm is the inclusion of some of their friends. You know, Graham Parsons sings background on All the Things. Terry Melcher plays organ on this album. Sneaky Pete Kleinow is on there. Byron Berline on fiddle. So they brought in a lot of friends, a lot of help, and I think that overall makes this album a very warm listen. And I think the studio disc is easily the best album of the later Byrds period. The live part is also very good, and again, it shows how they could play, how good of a live band they had become. One of the humorous things about this album is the title. If you notice, it says Untitled in parentheses in real small type. The reason that is it was a paperwork error, essentially. They filled out the paperwork for this to be printed and put the word Untitled in parentheses, wanting to title it later. They hadn't decided on a title, and the record company or the printer printed it just like that. So they just left it. So one of the things that I also want to mention is what I've mentioned in the last few albums, and that is how the Byrds were not always the best judge of their own material. There is this expanded CD version of this album called Untitled and Unissued, which has several more tracks. Many of the tracks are live cuts that didn't make this album, but there are also several excellent studio tracks that I find are better than some of the versions they use on the released album, namely All the Things. I think All the Things is one of their best late period songs. It's got the old Rickenbacker in there and some of Clarence White's best playing. In 1970, Gene Clarke's career was still flailing, and mostly due to his personal demons and his reluctance to tour. Jim Dixon also managed Gene Clarke, and Dixon arranged for the original Byrds to back him up on these two songs.
See that you can be more than one. She can fool you with her ways, leave you with nothing much to say.
Now, those two songs didn't get released until 1973 on this album called Roadmaster, and this is a reissue that I bought in the late 80s. It's basically a compilation of Gene Clarke songs that he recorded around this time. Speaking of the original Byrds, I want to take a little time to compare the two units, the original Byrds and the current Byrds from 1970. And when comparing the two, it's clear that the newer version is a much better live unit. And it was crucial for them to become a good live unit to build back their fan base, particularly in the late 60s when live playing was really required of you. The original Byrds were always a little bit spotty in their live shows. They were never very consistent, and they didn't rehearse a lot outside of the stage. So that hurt them. But what they didn't do live well, they made up for with their harmonies and their original songwriting. Now, it's my opinion, with the benefit of hindsight, that this would have been the perfect time to end the band, was after this album. Both fans liked it and critics liked it. Could have ended on a very high note, but they continued on. The next album was called Byrdmaniax, and this was a very difficult album for the band to record because they were all going through personal problems, mostly marital problems. Terry Melcher was still suffering in the wake of the Charles Manson murders, where he was an intended target, allegedly. And he not only was the band's producer, but he now became the band's manager. And he was surrounded by bodyguards all the time at this stage.
I love you in the daylight, when the sheets turn pale. Jamaica was a lovely one, and laid her well as we lay in the tall grass.
Now, that last song was written by Jackson Browne, and it sounds like pretty typical California country rock, but these next two singles that they released do not.
But somehow I know that everything's gonna work out. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Now the single Glory Glory only got to number 110, and you can hear those gospel-y choirs. Mary Clayton is one of the singers on that backing. So that's a little bit odd. We're getting back to the Lay Lady Lay choir that they didn't like. We'll talk about that in a moment. So these next three songs are written by Skip Battin and his writing partner King Fowley.
I ran to tunnel alone, feeling in the vacant spaces with the truth. Fat, ugly, fat man swam in a red tire made of stone.
So these three Skip Battin songs I find are very weak, and I've always held it against this album because it had so much weak material in it. The other thing that's a problem with these songs, it doesn't make use of the talents of Clarence White. Clarence White's guitar playing is subdued on this album for some reason, and the overdubs and orchestrations are just not fitting this band. It just doesn't seem to work. Now, these orchestrations were the subject of some problems with the band and Terry Melcher, and Melcher was given the okay to do this by McGuinn. McGuinn was the boss, he ran the band, and him and Melcher were pretty tight, so I think he trusted Melcher to do the right thing. But Melcher maybe overdid it a little bit, and the rest of the band did not like it. And they refer to this album as Melcher's Folly. Now, I'm sorry, but let me translate that for you. Melcher's Folly means, hey, these songs aren't good enough. There's only so much a producer can do to ruin a song. If the songs suck to begin with, there's not much more a producer can do to ruin them. That means that the material is weak. And I think Melcher maybe overplayed his hand a bit to try to prop these weak songs up, and it just didn't help at all. So I'm sure many of you do like this album. I personally do not like it. I think that McGuinn, in his effort to placate band members, there's quite a lot of democracy in this group, and a lot of these band members were able to contribute original songs, and I think that democracy led to the demise of the band. And this album, there was some critical backlash, and it only charted at number 46. After the slight debacle of Byrdmaniax, Terry Melcher quits as producer and is fired as manager. So the group at this point wants to produce themselves. They figure they can produce an album better than Melcher, and they book some studio time in England while they're on a tour. And in late '71, they released this single.
One of America's great national pastimes is drinking a Coke. Take farther along, we'll know all about it.
America's Great National Pastime didn't even chart, so they were off to a rough start with this album. But these next three songs are probably the highlight of what was to become the album farther along.
Well, you think you got it bad, and you think that you've been had.
Mean old bugler, wheeling wine, blue tick helm and the redneck chime. We thought happiness hit me on the first day that we met. She was sitting in my...
So one curious thing about this album is that McGuinn only sings on 3 of the songs. That's lead vocals anyway, and it doesn't sound very Byrds-like. Now this album was recorded and mixed in 2 weeks, and it sounds like it. In their effort to go the opposite direction of Melcher and show him up a bit, this left listeners to hear the thinness of the original material. Now this album didn't do well at all. The original writing sounds predictable, it sounds formulaic, and this is probably the Byrds' weakest album. In the coming months, Battin and Parsons get fired, and Chris Hillman fills in a little bit where needed. Bruce Johnston helps out on some studio recordings, as does drummer John Guerin. Guerin is also playing live at this late version of the Byrds. These 2 final albums by the Byrds, for me personally, were a very poor swan song for the band. I felt it would have been better had they ended on this album, but you know, it's not how it always goes. I do know some people do appreciate these last 2 albums, so that's good that they do have some fans. But the fact of the matter is that the original Byrds cast a very large shadow, and it was very hard to deal with that legacy for the other Byrds that came later. And it just kind of petered out. I mean, I think the Byrds overall in these latter years did a fine job. By January of 1972, the Byrds were in free fall, and it seemed like an appropriate time to possibly do a reunion with the original 5 Byrds. And this was all the rage at this time, was this kind of supergroup mentality. And the Byrds kind of constituted somewhat of a supergroup, the original Byrds anyway. And David Geffen started smelling dollar signs here. So what they had to do, everybody was pretty much available. Crosby was on hiatus from Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Almost a permanent hiatus, I guess you could say. And McGuinn just had to be not bought out of the Columbia deal, but they had to broker a deal so he could record on the Asylum label. Rehearsals began at Roger McGuinn's place, and they approached these sessions somewhat like a Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young session, where you have solo artists bring their stuff in and everybody supports them. So it doesn't feel like a band. It doesn't feel like the old Byrds. Now this album, let me show you here. This is it right here. And it is just called Byrds, and it's got the original members named here at the top. And again, this reminds me of how Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young kind of did things. Every member is singled out. So this is the album, and it was originally going to be called Full Circle.
Circle takes your flight, and if it's right, brings it back again. Sweet lady, I've got to believe it, or I can't let you into my life. Goodbye, won't be long, I'm on my way back home. So much I've got to say, I hope you'll understand my way.
Now these are 3 of the stronger songs on the album, and you hear a lot of Chris Hillman's mandolin, which somewhat replaces McGuinn's electric 12-string on this record. Now Full Circle was released as a single. It got to number 109. But I think the reason why the album wasn't called Full Circle is because Gene Clarke had already recorded that song earlier. Now Crosby also chipped in a couple of very good songs, and those are these 2.
I was mistaken. Was only another strange. Is that the place you wanted?
I love that guitar break on Long Live the King. Not the strongest song, but very, very funky little guitar break by McGuinn in there. Now I was puzzled at first when they did the song Laughing, because Crosby had already done this on his prior solo album called If I Could Only Remember My Name. And I think he did it for this album because he had originally written that in '67 and potentially could have been a Byrd song. He was a Byrd when he wrote it, so they re-recorded it for this album. Now those songs really contrast with these next 2 songs that seem to be produced for AM radio.
I'm gonna rock and roll, to satisfy your soul. I'm gonna rock and roll. Things will be better now. Don't ask me why, don't ask me how. And both of us.
Now the Byrds had planned to do a Dylan song, but they couldn't decide or find an appropriate one for them to do, so they wound up doing 2 Neil Young songs and a Joni Mitchell song. And I just think that these are bad choices, and they were actually low on material. And this album, let's just have a look here. They actually were very cordial with one another in doing this album, and they knew that there was some past problems they had between band members, and they came with the right attitude, and they were very polite. As you can see, some very, very nice photography here. These photos were taken at the Troubadour. But the politeness probably made it a little bit too bland. I mean, the good thing about the Byrds when they were at their best is probably when they had that edge. Crosby was brought in he produced it, and probably because it was on the Asylum label, which was his label, and some of the band didn't like him having that much control over it, and there was still some issues. The other thing that McGuinn said is that Crosby brought this fantastic weed, so these guys were pretty loaded when they're doing this album. Another problem is that Chris Hillman had said, and he admitted to not bringing his best material for this album. I mean, I think some of these guys were saving their best material for their solo stuff, so that was an issue. And Gene Clarke said that it hasn't got the punch that it could have had if we had taken the time to make a better album. So that's pretty much, I think, says it all. They didn't take their time. I think they banged through it faster than they should have. Hillman and McGuinn were recording on the weekends in between this album. So I don't know. It was more of a contractual thing, and I think it was more of a cash-in by the record label, I think, and didn't allow the Byrds to really rehearse and get into the proceedings so they could deliver a proper album. So I give this album a C for Crosby, and it's got some good songs on it. Actually, this album was my cousin Ricky's. I borrowed it from him in like 1983, and I never gave it back. So Rick, I still got your album, and I like this album. It's not, I wouldn't say it's essential, but every Byrd fan should have it. It's got some good stuff on it, and it at least shows you where they were at, possibly had they continued into the 70s. So the experience with this reunion album, it just fizzled out, and I think there was hope to do additional Byrds albums, but it never happened. And that was in 1973 by the time this came out. And also in 73, the Byrds' legacy died 2 more deaths with the passing of Clarence White, who was killed after a gig by a drunk driver, and then by Graham Parsons, who overdosed on morphine and alcohol. Keith Richards had stated in a 2004 documentary, Fallen Angel, that Parsons understood the danger of combining opiates and alcohol and should have known better. So that was an accident. He was living the rock and roll lifestyle. And to make things even stranger, 2 of his friends stole the body from the LA International Airport and went to Joshua Tree and burned the body in some funeral pyre, because that was where Parsons wanted to be buried. And the guys were arrested, but they only had to pay like a $750 fine. So apparently there was no law against stealing a dead body at that time. But it made the story stranger and more legendary. Now that ended the Byrds in rather dramatic fashion, and through the rest of the decade there was lots of solo material. There's an album of trio of McGuinn, Clarke, and Hillman. This came out in 78. You had this compilation, Best of the Byrds Greatest Hits Volume 2, later period Byrds hits, and some album tracks. Not a fan of this album, I was disappointed with it. The European version is better. This album is a live album, live in Rome 1968. This features Graham Parsons and Doug Dillard. If you're looking for more Byrds live material, there's a great album from the Fillmore from '69 that's highly recommended. There are other best of albums. There's one called The Original Singles, Volume 1 and 2. Those are excellent compilations if you can find them. I think it covers the A-sides and B-sides of their singles, and if you want best ofs, those would be the 2 best ones to get, in my opinion. Now, one thing I brought up a couple times in these videos were the pre-flight sessions, and that was re-released on this album from Rhino in 1988 called In the Beginning. And these are some different mixes from the many releases that came out from 1969 and through the 70s. You'll see this album, the original Pre-Flight, in several different album covers. This one is actually very good. It's got a couple songs that had never been released on those Pre-Flight albums, and the CD has even more tracks. Now, possibly the most anticipated Byrds compilation is this one called Never Before. This came out in 1987, and by the late 80s, the Byrds were somewhat in demand. They were getting popular again. You had Tom Petty, who was very popular, and R.E.M., both using that jangle guitar sound, and there was just a lot of interest in 60s bands at the time. And the Byrds had several unreleased songs in the vaults, and this was an attempt to cover some of those songs and some rare like singles or B-sides.
Now I wonder if she'll ever wanna settle down. And it's all over now, baby blue. For a half a year, Psychodrama City, don't need none today.
The great thing about this album is it covers both the folk rock period and the psychedelic period, and one of the songs on here is a rare B-side from the movie Don't Make Waves.
Well, don't make waves, don't make waves, don't make waves.
Now, some of the other songs on here that cover the more psychedelic period, we have Gene Clark's The Day Walk, or Never Before, as it's called on this compilation. We have a great Crosby song called It Happens Each Day, and a great piece called I Know My Rider.
And the question stands in the palms of hands of the wretches picking pieces of their mind. Like a silent ray of sunlight catching in my eyes, like some circle around the sun.
Now, one of the things that I want to bring up here, when this album came out in '87, they released a CD in 1989 with 7 more tracks on it. There was some hand-wringing that, hey, these other tracks weren't included here. They were included on the CD 2 years later. So I had to buy this again. I was a little bit pissed, but I bought it because I love to hear the new songs. So a couple of the songs I mentioned, they're all on the CD. Ditto, here's the CD of In the Beginning as well. There's more tracks on this one as well. So if you're looking to get those, the CD might be the way to go. Now, one of the songs that got away that we did not hear is a song called Milestones, and that was a Miles Davis song that the Byrds attempted to do and did record. And unfortunately, it was not released on this, and I think because they couldn't find the tapes. Now, producer Gary Usher knows where the tapes were because he said it in an interview, and he realized that, oh, I figured that's probably why it wasn't released, because they don't know where that tape is. Unfortunately, he died in the late 80s, so that tape is somewhere in Columbia's vaults.
These are the Byrds. They are songmakers. Much of their music is improvised, worked out in informal jam sessions such as this. Like most of their generation, they write as they feel.
So one last thing, if you're looking to buy some Byrds material, I would try the expanded CDs. Those were remastered by Columbia Legacy by Bob Irwin, and the sound quality, I'm told, is very good. So thank you so much for sticking around for all 4 parts of the Byrds. This was a long one, and I can assure you there's plenty more coming here on Pop Goes the 60s.